The following is a special presentation on AZTV 7.
Welcome to Before You Vote. I'm Mike Broomhead. This AZTV special program is here to help you, the voter, understand the 2022 midterm election. We'll be talking with candidates and data analysts to give you insight into who and what is on the ballot. Now today, we're breaking down the legislative and congressional district races here in Arizona. While there are too many races to talk about specifically, we're going to analyze the most competitive districts and which races you should be watching. Plus, we'll take a look at how the recent redistricting is having an effect on all of these races. To help explain it all is Hank Stephenson and Rachel Leingang, co-founders of the publication Arizona Agenda. They'll be in studio. And just to give you some background on the publication, it's what Rachel and Hank describe as an insider publication for political outsiders. They have great insight into both the legislative and congressional races. Plus, Mike Noble from OH Predictive Insights is back in our Tracking Arizona segment. We'll be talking about how the top issues for voters have changed since the primary election. We'll also look at the importance of the top 4 issues broken down by party. We're going to bring you all of this information that you need to know on the show next. So make sure you stick around. We'll be back here on Before You Vote in 60 seconds. And welcome back to Before You Vote, talking about very important races, starting with the Arizona State Legislature. Joining me, co-founders of the Arizona Agenda, Rachel Leingang and Hank Stephenson. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here.
Let's talk about some of these legislative races. First of all, let's talk about demographics. Redistricting first. How is that going to affect some of these key races? Is this going to make a big difference?
It always makes a big difference, and sometimes in a way that you don't quite know until the first election or two happens after redistricting. We have a general idea of who has the advantage, but because we have such a big independent voting block, you never quite know.
All new districts, you can kind of take some guesses on what did that area do, but as the boundaries change, it's all up in the air at this point.
Do you think redistricting has benefited one political party or the other more?
It doesn't seem like it.
This was a pretty fair process this year. We've heard a lot of complaints in past redistricting cycles about the redistricting commission favoring one party or the other, but I feel like this year they got to a pretty good place where most people involved in the process who are acting in good faith walked away from it feeling like they got a fair shake.
So before we dive into specific races, last question is, we've seen Maricopa County just put out their numbers on demographics, and the independent voter registration is the highest of all of them. How does that impact this?
We are super swingable as a state. In a lot of these districts, independents will, decide the race. Even if there's like a lean one way or the other, the independents are going to play a pivotal role. It happens statewide, happens in districts too, the competitive districts.
Yeah, and independents, at the end of the day, are almost certainly voting for a Republican or a Democrat. They have a preference. It's kind of figuring out what is the preference of that chunk of independents in any given district. And I think that'll be what 2022 tells us.
So of the races that we have going on, which do you see as the biggest toss-up or most competitive?
I think like CD4 or LD4 and LD2, and there's a potential flip in one of the legislative districts too, District 9. There are about 5 of them that we're keeping an eye on. I'm a little less convinced that the Pinal County district that has Senator TJ Shope in it is actually really swingable. But the other ones, if they went either way, I wouldn't be super surprised.
So let's talk about 2 for just a second. What makes it competitive, and what do you see the leanings being there?
It's competitive, I think, because of the single shot strategy that the Democrats are trying, and then because one of the Republicans running for the House is further right than the district. Christian Lamar is like a far-right mega candidate, and that district is really not that Republican. It's not super far-right. It has a Republican lean, but the lean is smaller than it looks.
So the research that you do, does it show that if you are, let's say within your party, if you lean far left in a district that's not far left, does it hurt you with Democrat voters like this? Would it hurt him with Republican voters?
It would hurt probably more with the independent or swingable vote, or like a moderate Republican. There are Republicans who are really not interested in election denialism, so they might be willing to cross the aisle.
You're both saying that you think that there might be a flip in one of these. Where do you possibly see the flip?
Probably Legislative District 9, that's kind of the Mesa area. For a long time that has been in Republican hands. It's kind of trending slightly bluer out there, and with the redistricting, Democrats actually have a slight edge over there, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that this is a chance for Democrats to take what was a fully Republican district in the past, or at least a fully Republican area, and overtake that, both House seats and the Senate seats.
So for people like myself that I don't dive in as deep as you do into these numbers, I look at the East Valley, Mesa, Gilbert, being dark red most of the time. Is this unique, or is this a sign of a trend in that out there?
Well, a lot of like the Chandler area has been changing very rapidly. You've got a lot of tech businesses moving into that area. That's bringing in people from California, a lot of new business out there. And you're just seeing a slow motion demographic shift. We saw in what was the old Legislative District 17, that's the Chandler area, started out in 2012 after redistricting as a fully red Republican district, and by the end of this last decade, it was a mostly Democratic district. So you're seeing that kind of thing happen across the East Valley to varying degrees.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends heavily on which district it is. And a lot of our districts are not competitive at all. There certainly are in the East Valley, many of them that there's no chance that a Democrat wins. But in a pocket like where J.D. Mesnard is right now, that's a more competitive district, and it's because it's a different area than it was 10 years ago. So.
And East Mesa is very different from West Mesa. You know, when you're bordering up against Tempe, it's very much depends on where those lines are specifically drawn.
So we now know there is such a thin majority as it exists for Republicans. Do Republicans maintain the majority in your opinion? Do they maintain the majority and expand it? Do they lose it? Does it end up in a tie in either of these chambers? What do you think?
I could see a tie, which would be really fascinating for governing purposes. It could also be that the margins stay about what they are. A lot of these competitive districts, because of the single shot strategy, it seems like they could be split, where there is like a Republican representative and a Democratic one. And the weirder part of it this year is that the people who won in the primaries, especially on the Republican side, are further right than the people who are leaving. So we could have a split, but the right wing is further right than it was before, which makes it really hard to form a coalition. There's not a lot of people in that moderate area.
So you to be clear, you're saying it could be Republican majority, or it could be a tie. Is there a chance that the Democrats could control either chamber from what you're seeing?
Very, very narrow chance. There's always a chance, but yeah, that doesn't seem like the most likely scenario. There's a pathway for the Democrats to get to 30 Republicans in the House, which would or 30 Democrats in the House, which would tie the chamber. There's a pathway to get to 16 Democrats in the Senate, which would overtake it, but that's a really narrow path. I think best case scenario for the Democrats is probably looking at a 15-15 Senate and a large minority in the House.
All right, we got one more segment. I want to talk about the congressional races and how this all plays out in the same order. So we're going to be back here in just a moment with this expertise. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. Stick around on Before You Vote. Coming up, how have the top issues changed for voters since the primary election? And Mike Noble tells us all of that next in our Tracking Arizona segment. Plus, we're back with Rachel and Hank from Arizona Agenda, looking at the 4 most competitive congressional races and if Republicans have a chance to win back the House. This is Before You Vote. Welcome back to Before You Vote. It is time for our Tracking Arizona segment. So, of course, that means Mike Noble joins us, the head of research at OH Predictive Insights. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Let's talk about the top issues for people in Arizona as this kind of ebbs and flows. Some of it's still staying the same, although it may not be as strong as before, right?
Correct. And when you look at the top issues overall among Arizonans, what are they concerned about? The top two issues by far and away are jobs and the economy and immigration. But what's very distant down at the bottom of the list is education and healthcare.
When you look at this, when you break it down by party affiliation, no big surprise really. The Democrats care a lot more about education. You're seeing it lower with Republicans. But what about that big number for independent voters on jobs and economy? What does that tell you about these elections?
Well, it tells us a lot because, again, with these all-important independent voters, the voters in the middle that aren't so much party loyal as Democrats and Republicans, what is keeping them up at night? What are they concerned about? And jobs and the economy and immigration are hands-on the top two issues. And healthcare and education really aren't moving the needle, which is interesting because education, our last few election cycles here, has always risen to be kind of a top issue. But right now, this election, it's very low on voters' priority lists.
So when it comes to jobs and the economy, we know that the interest rate had just been raised by the Fed another 3/4 of a point. We've been told it's going to be another 3/4 of a point again before the end of the year, possibly. Do you expect that number to go even higher in concerns about jobs and the economy?
Absolutely. And what we're seeing right now is that as the more pressure on these pain points gets applied to voters, you're going to see that voter sentiment increase in dissatisfaction. The only interesting part is that with the border crisis that's going on, especially recently, that could bump into it. But again, they're both equally important. So depending on immigration, how that ebbs and flows, but absolutely jobs and economy, seeing that continue to rise.
When you look at the other issues with independent voters, it's pretty equal with the others with them. Is there a point there for, let's say, the Democrats to get some votes on education, since it's a big issue for them, if they message right to the independent voters?
I think if it's done correctly and how they're messaging, but I think more on a state level compared to the federal level. However, we're just not really seeing that happen very much. It's very much a referendum of Trump doppelgangers, of, hey, we shouldn't be voting for them. So they really haven't done a good job of articulating their positions this year and more just running against the Trump-aligned candidates.
Well, as always, Mike, your information is solid. We appreciate you joining us this week. You get the final word. What do you think? Do you think this jobs and economy remains the biggest issue overall by far throughout this election?
I believe by the time we get to Election Day, jobs and economy will be #1 issue with immigration close behind.
Thanks. That's Mike Noble from OH Predictive Insights. We'll be back here in just a moment on Before You Vote. Coming up, does the U.S. House of Representatives have a chance to flip? We're taking a look at the most competitive congressional races here in Arizona. This is Before You Vote. Hey, welcome back to Before You Vote. So far, a great conversation. Let's jump into the congressional district races. Same basic questions. First, an overview. Is this going to change a lot of these districts? Is it really going to make a big difference in some places, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty vulnerable races here that could swing to the other party. Whether it affects the makeup of Congress, I mean, that's kind of outside of our purview as reporters in the state. But definitely there are new faces here that people will get used to as their representatives, which matters for constituent services, for our people who have bully pulpits in the state, that kind of thing.
We'll get at least one new congressperson out of southern Arizona, and several of our incumbents are pretty vulnerable this year.
So let's start kind of in order. District 1, where Schweikert is, he's been able to, there's been a lot of hits at Schweikert, justified or not, been hit in his direction. Has it worked? Is there a chance here for Hodge to take this seat?
I think there would have been if Democrats were actually spending more in that race. They've been relatively inactive, like national groups coming in to spend on Hodge's behalf. I think Schweikert is vulnerable, but he was probably more vulnerable in the primary. And that's why you saw a lot of his money get spent there. You saw a lot of money spent against him at that time. But the general has not been as competitive in terms of like the ads and things like that as I thought it would be.
So with that in mind, with you saying you believe the vulnerability was there, what would be the reason that they wouldn't spend?
They've got to defend other seats.
Okay.
I think the Democrats are focused on keeping, the members that they have. Greg Stanton's district in Phoenix is looking a little bit more competitive. There are a lot of races across the country that are competitive where they've got to play defense.
So let's jump there. How is it competitive because of demographic shifts and district shifts, or is it competitive because of Washington, D.C. and inflation and the economy?
Well, so are we talking about Schweikert's district?
No, just in general. But when you talk about Stanton, let's start with Stanton. Is that a demographic shift from the redistricting, or do you think it's because of inflation and people voting with their wallets?
Both.
Okay.
His district got slightly more Republican, a little bit harder for him to win. And, this was at least supposed to be a Republican wave year. You would expect, with Democrats controlling all the levers of power in Washington, D.C., that we would see a, swing back of the pendulum there towards Republicans. I think the abortion issue might have changed the dynamic on that a little bit, but it's still probably going to be a fairly good year for Republicans, and I don't think Democrats are taking that seat for granted.
Yeah, and that district still has a Democratic edge. Stanton is not like a controversial Democrat, I wouldn't say. I think he probably still pulls that one out, but it probably will be closer than previous elections that he's faced. And it might be one that, because of redistricting, they're especially wary. The district could look a certain way on paper, but then in practice actually, functions elsewhere.
And in the world of political strategy, as you alluded to, if they're pulling money away or not spending money in a race like Hodge against Schweikert because they have to defend Stanton's seat, what does that say about the state of what's going on, right?
That this will probably be a pretty good year for Republicans. I think, Dem optimism peaked probably a couple of weeks ago. And what we hear from Democratic operatives is not as rosy an outlook these days as we're heading into early voting. And this is really when you want your people the most fired up. And it doesn't seem like that timing is quite clicking.
Now, you're the experts, but my eyes tell me that based on redistricting, the person that has been the biggest disadvantage with that would be O'Halloran. Am I right or wrong?
Correct.
Yep.
Probably in the country.
In the country?
He has one of probably the most vulnerable incumbent in the country from what people have said about him. The district became even redder. The races he was in before were very close. There's been a lot of spending there, but that'll be a tough one for him to pull out a victory.
So is that another race then that they're walking away from? I'm talking about the Democratic Party and saying we're going to have to concede some things, and if we're going to win the war, we are going to lose some battles. Is this the one you think they've given up on?
I don't think they've given up on that one. They're still wanting to keep an incumbent over funding a newcomer, because incumbency is, one of the biggest assets going into an election. So defending an incumbent makes more sense in terms of finances than, funding a newcomer like Hodge.
So I asked you this about the legislative districts, the statewide race or the state races. Now, for this one, how big of a role is it? An even bigger role now in voter opinions on what's happening in D.C. Right? This is where they're focusing here on a lot of. So it's a bigger hill for the Democrats to climb, right?
Yeah, these are federal politicians. These are the people we send to D.C. So it's a whole lot easier to tie Tom O'Halloran to Nancy Pelosi than, Katie Hobbs or somebody here who is working in Arizona. So yeah, the national mood, the federal politics play huge in the congressional
and then
races.
also just like the typical sort of cycle that we have is whatever party wins the next midterm, they usually have like a backlash. So that's what this cycle is. The Democrats won all House, Senate, and the presidency in 2020. Now we're seeing that sort of backlash here. It was expected to be widely favorable, and I think it is probably more competitive than a lot of people on both sides had anticipated.
Last race, Siscomani-Engel. What happens there?
Tough one.
That's a true toss-up.
Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's probably the most competitive. We don't have an incumbent running. Ann Kirkpatrick resigned. It's brand new representation, brand new seat. This is a district that Gabby Giffords more or less represented back in the day. Martha McSally has represented. Ron Barber. It's gone Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat every couple of years. I don't even want to posit a guess who's going to win this one.
Yeah.
So again, this is going to be one of those districts where it's turnout and probably those independent, non-committal independents in the end, right?
Yeah, and probably the broader the electoral wins of a certain year, because it's that area has switched seats. It could be one of those that, depending on what the broader year is, changes over time. It really is a competitive one. Both of those candidates are competitive candidates, so yeah, I have no idea. Would not put money on that one. So.
Well, this is really a fascinating conversation for me. So I hope we can do this again because the information is fantastic, and like you, I'm so compelled by these races. So I appreciate at least some opinions of clarification on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right, it's going to be a competitive race. Hopefully, this is going to help you be an informed voter. That's what we always say. But this is just some of the opinions based on redistricting and some other things of where things are leaning. So stick around. We'll be back here in a minute on Before You Vote. Welcome back to Before You Vote. A big thank you to Hank Stephenson and Rachel Leingang, the co-founders of the Arizona Agenda publication. What great guests they've been. And of course, Mike Noble from OH Predictive Insights and the insight he gave us. We've covered all top 6 races, interviewing candidates on their positions on the top issues. If you've missed any of them, you can head over to aztv.com/vote. There, you're also going to find links to voter resources, such as how to request a mail-in ballot. Now remember, the last day to request a mail-in ballot is October 28th. And for those of you who are already signed up to receive a mail-in ballot, be on the lookout as early voting has begun on October 12th, and ballots have already been mailed out. We are only 2 weeks away from the general election, so make sure you stay informed and be an informed voter like we always say. Make sure you join us next week right here on Before You Vote.